Welcome to the third part of the Biology 6 lecture on the nervous system. Now, I know this sounds kind of weird, but I split part 3, this part, into two parts. Part 3a, which is this video, and part 3b, which is the next video. So in the previous part of this nervous system lecture, in other words, in part 2, we focused a lot on proteins in neuron membranes, right? We talked about these sodium ion channel proteins and potassium ion channel proteins, for example. In this third part of the nervous system lecture, we're going to focus on larger parts of the nervous system, like some organs and things of the nervous system, not on the proteins that you find inside the neurons. Okay, well, let's begin with a little bit of a review of the divisions of the nervous system. We learned in the first part of this lecture on the nervous system that the nervous system is defined as all the organs that are made out of nervous tissue. And in this drawing, all the organs that you see in sort of yellow colors are the nervous system. But remember that they subdivide the organs of the nervous system into two main groups. One group are called the central nervous system, and so that is the brain and the spinal cord, and they call it the central nervous system because those two organs make up essentially the central axis of your body. They go down the central axis of the body. And the other part of the nervous system is called the peripheral nervous system, or PNS for short, and that's defined as all the nervous tissue organs that are outside of the brain and spinal cord. And so what are these organs? Well, they're mostly nerves. What you see here in this diagram are the nerves that connect to the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so your nervous system is the CNS, the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, plus the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, which is mostly all the nerves that connect to the brain and the spinal cord. And together, those two make up the nervous system. Okay, well, let's now introduce some terms that relate. So we're going to begin with the central nervous system before we do the PNS. So let's begin with some terms that relate to the central nervous system. So here you see a bunch of neurons bundled together, and oftentimes that's what you find inside the central nervous system, groups of neurons bundled together like this. And the term for this is a tract. A tract, if you look at the lecture handout, it says a tract is a bundle of axons in the nervous system. Now, it really should have said a bundle of the entire neurons, but since most of the tract is made up of the axons, we can say that a tract is a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. Now, just as a review question, we're talking about we're talking about the central nervous system here. But if this were a bundle of neurons in the peripheral nervous system, it's not called a tract. Who remembers? What do we call a bundle of neurons in the peripheral nervous system? And the answer to that is a nerve. So if it's a bundle of neurons, if it's in the peripheral nervous system, you call it a nerve, and if it's in the central nervous system, you call it a tract. Okay, so that's a tract. In the central nervous system, wherever you find an area, a cluster of neuron cell bodies, like you see here, that's called a nucleus. And so, in this drawing right here, you see 3 neuron cell bodies all clustered together. And so you'd say that is a nucleus of the central nervous system. Okay, and as another review question, in the peripheral nervous system, we also had a term for bundles of cell bodies. Does anybody remember what a bundle of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called? And the answer to that is a ganglion. Yeah, so again, we have 2 different words for essentially the same thing. Bundle of cell bodies in the central nervous system is a nucleus. A bundle of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglion. All right, well, here's another term that relates to the central nervous system. So axons are almost always myelinated, meaning that they have a sheath of this white fatty material called myelin coating the axon. And because myelin is a white material, the regions of the central nervous system that are mostly made of these myelinated axons will appear white when you look at them. And so they call that the white matter of the central nervous system, and it's myelin-coated axons, the white matter of the CNS is. The cell bodies and their dendrites, because they are, those parts of the neurons are not coated with myelin, are not white, they're more grayish. And so the term the gray matter of the central nervous system means, well, what you see there. It means the cell bodies and the dendrites. Okay, so now you know about white matter and gray matter of the central nervous system, and about tracts and nuclei of the nervous system. Of the central nervous system, I should say. Okay, here's a diagram of parts of the central nervous system. Here's the brain, and there's the beginning of the spinal cord right there. The brain and the spinal cord of the central nervous system are surrounded by a watery fluid that's called the cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF for short. So it's a watery fluid that surrounds and bathes and protects the central nervous system. Now, if a person receives an injury to their head, what sometimes can happen is that they tear a membrane that keeps the CSF in, and so they can start to get CSF leaking out of their nose or their ears. And emergency workers are trained, when they're inspecting a person who's had a head injury, emergency workers are trained to look for the CSF leaking out of the person's nose or ears. It looks like sort of a clear material, almost like mucus, almost like snot coming out of the nose or ears. But if the emergency workers see that, then that's not a good sign. That shows that the membrane that holds in the CSF has been torn. Anyway, the cerebrospinal fluid is this watery liquid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. Inside the brain are some hollow areas that are filled with the CSF, and we call those the ventricles of the brain. The brain has several ventricles in it. Okay, well, so we're going to now focus our talk about the central nervous system on the brain, and after we get done discussing the brain of the central nervous system, then we'll start talking about the spinal cord of the central nervous system. But yeah, let's start with the brain. The brain has four major regions, and I'm going to add some color to this diagram now so you can see the four major regions. Now, obviously in real life, the four regions of the brain are not different colors. This is just so we can see them better. But anyway, here they are. Here's the cerebrum, this whole part you see in yellow here. That's called the cerebrum region of the brain. The parts that are shown in purple right there, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. The parts that are shown in purple, light purple and dark purple, are called the diencephalon region of the brain. The parts that shown in green here is called the brain stem. And incidentally, the brainstem is not the spine. The spine begins below the brainstem. The brainstem is a region of the brain, not the spine. And this last part, this kind of a red-orange colored region right there, is called the cerebellum, which unfortunately looks and sounds a little bit like cerebrum, but those are two different regions of the brain. The cerebrum and the cerebellum are two different regions. Okay, so yeah, so the four major regions of the brain: cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. So what we're going to do now is go through these four regions one at a time and talk about, what brain functions are found in each of these four regions, starting with the cerebellum. Starting with the cerebrum. Okay, so let me make the other ones kind of fade away. Obviously, they're still there in the real brain, but we're focusing our attention first on the cerebrum region of the brain. So if you look in your lecture handout, it says this about the cerebrum. It says it is the largest and most superior brain region. Largest, it's bigger than the cerebellum and the brainstem and the diencephalon. And when it says most superior, it means highest up. It's further upward than the other regions. All right, and the lecture handout says the cerebrum has many functions, including sense perception, muscle movements, emotion, memories, and higher functions, meaning things like language and social behavior and logic and forming mental images. All right, let's start our discussion of the cerebrum with some general characteristics of how the neurons in the cerebrum are arranged. Okay, if you could somehow see the actual individual neurons of the cerebrum, you would find that most of those neurons are pointing inward in the cerebrum. In other words, for most of the neurons in the cerebrum, their dendrites and cell bodies are more here on the surface of the cerebrum, and their axons are more pointed inward. And incidentally, they refer to the surface of the cerebrum as the cerebral cortex. Cortex means surface. So the cerebral cortex, the surface of the cerebrum, is mostly gray matter. Remember, gray matter means where you find the cell bodies and dendrites of neurons within the central nervous system. Whereas if you go a little bit deeper, that's where the axons of these cerebrum neurons are located. And since the axons are coated in that white myelin, that's white. That area is white matter in the cerebrum. Yeah. So just recapping, for most of the cerebrum, it's gray matter on the surface, and it's white matter deeper below the surface. But there's one exception to that. Within the cerebrum are some areas called the basal nuclei. And remember, nuclei means where there are clusters of cell bodies in the central nervous system. So that's going to be a type of gray matter, right? Yeah, so the basal nuclei are where you find cell bodies of neurons that are not here on the cortex of the cerebrum. The basal nuclei are more deeper in the cerebrum. All right, well, the cerebrum is divided into a left half and a right half. In this next view, let's imagine that we're above the cerebrum, looking down on it. Yeah, you can kind of see here. Here's the person's left half of their cerebrum and the right half of their cerebrum. And they call these, the two halves, the cerebral hemispheres, the left and right halves of the cerebrum. And for the most part, the two halves are mirror images of each other. And so what I mean by that is, if there's a structure, let's say in this part, that has some particular function, you'll find that same matching structure on this side, the same structure doing the same function in this area. And likewise, if right here there was a certain structure carrying out some function, you would find the mirror image, essentially that same structure also on this hemisphere over here doing the same function. So generally, in terms of the structural areas of the hemispheres, they are mirror images of each other. But there are a few structures that you only find on one half and not the other. And we'll give an example of this later, but as one example, there's a region in this part of the left hemisphere that's involved in language, and you do not find the matching mirror image language structure here on the right side. And so that type of thing, where you find a structure only on one cerebral hemisphere and not the other, they call cerebral lateralization, structures and functions that are only on one hemisphere and not the other. But remember, that's kind of the exception, and for the most part, you do find the same structures on the left half and the right half, in the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the cerebrum. Okay, now for the cerebrum to function properly, the two halves must be able to communicate with each other. And so there's a large tract. Remember, a tract means a group of axons in the central nervous system. There's a large tract that allows for communication between the two cerebral hemispheres, and this is called the corpus callosum. All right. Incidentally, callosum means white, like chalk-like, because it's white matter. It's myelinated axons. All right, very good. This is one way that the cerebrum is divided. It's divided into a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. The cerebrum is also divided into regions called lobes, which are based on the skull bones that cover those regions of the cerebrum. So remember back from your anatomy class that the various bones of the skull have their different names. The frontal bone is in the front of the skull, and then the parietal bones make up part of the wall of the skull, so do the temporal bones, and the occipital bone makes the back of the skull. And so what I'm saying is that there are regions of the brain that are underneath, like these. Like there's a region of the brain underneath the frontal bone. They call that the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. And there's a region of the cerebrum underneath the parietal bones, and we call that the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. And the region under the temporal bone is called the temporal lobe. And there's an occipital lobe of the cerebrum also. Matter of fact, I think the next slide shows us those there. There we go. There's the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And again, they are named after the bones that cover them. Okay, so now you know a little bit about the arrangement of the neurons in the cerebrum and how it's divided in different regions like left hemisphere and right hemisphere and these various lobes of the cerebrum. So now it's time to get to a lot more specific details about the areas of the cerebrum and exactly what their functions are. Okay, so let's begin with the sense areas of the cerebrum. There are regions of the cerebrum called the sense areas, and these are areas that receive nerve signals, from sensory neurons, and these sense areas of the cerebrum not only receive the nerve signals from these sensory neurons, but allow us to experience that senses, to be consciously aware of the taste or the smell or the sight. Let's see. So as one example, there's a visual area. As you can see, this visual area is in the occipital lobe. And so this is the area of the cerebrum that receives nerve signals from your eyes. So the sensory neurons in your eyes send their sensory signals to the visual area of the cerebrum. And it's when the visual area receives those nerve signals, that's what allows you to experience the being able to see stuff. All right, and here's another example. There's an area of the cerebrum called the auditory area, and that area receives the nerve signals from your ears. And so when it receives those nerve signals, that allows you to experience the sound. That's how you essentially hear the sound. And there's another area in the cerebrum called the olfactory area. The olfactory means smell, and so nerve signals from your nose are sent there, and that olfactory area allows you to experience the scent of whatever it is you're smelling. And there's another area called the gustatory area. Gustatory means taste, so the scent signals from your mouth are sent to the gustatory area for processing to allow you to experience the taste of the foods that you're eating. And of course, another sense is touch, and so there's a sense area of the cerebrum called the primary sensory area. And I think that name is a little confusing. It's the touch area, and so the nerve signals from your touch sense get sent there. Now, of course, the sensory neurons for your sense of touch are embedded in your skin. In other words, your skin is the sense organ for your sense of touch. But from your skin all over the body, the sensory nerve signals are sent to this primary sensory area, this touch area, and that allows you to experience the touch sensation in the various parts of your body. Now, what I think is here's something I think is kind of fascinating. Anatomists have even been able to locate within the primary sensory area exactly where the touch nerve signals arrive from the various parts of our body. Here's kind of a map, and you don't have to memorize this map, but I think it's kind of utterly fascinating. Like if somebody were to touch your hips, the touch nerve signals from the hips arrive at that part of the primary sensory area. And if someone were to touch your neck, that part of the primary sensory area receives those neck touch signals. And if someone were to, touch your nose, it looks like that right there is the exact part of the primary sensory area where the touch signals on your nose arrive and are processed. Okay, but like I said, I'm not going to quiz you on exactly where these are located. You don't have to know that the hip comes before the trunk and the trunk comes before the neck, but I do want you to know that they've actually localized within the primary sensory area the exact locations where the touch signals from the various body parts arrive. Right next to the primary sensory area is a different area that's called the primary motor area. And the primary motor area is the area of the cerebrum where voluntary motor signals, meaning signals that control voluntary muscles, are generated. So remember that there are various types of muscles, and some muscles you do not have conscious control over. In other words, with some muscles, you don't consciously decide when those muscles contract or relax, and we call those involuntary muscles. But other muscles in your body, you do have conscious control over. You decide when those muscles contract and relax. And just to give an example, your muscles of your arms, like your biceps and triceps, or the muscles of your thighs, like your quadriceps or your pectoralis majors, pretty much all the muscles that you learned in your anatomy class are voluntary muscles. And so, yeah, so what I'm saying is there's this region here in the cerebrum called the primary motor area, and it's responsible for generating those motor signals that ultimately get sent to those voluntary muscles to allow you to control them. Now, interestingly, in the primary motor area, anatomists have even identified the regions within the primary motor area where the motor signals are generated for controlling various body parts. And here's a map. And again, you don't have to memorize this exact map. I'm not going to quiz you and say, is the hip region of the primary motor area and right next to the trunk region, and is the trunk region right next to the neck region? But I do want you to know that anatomists have figured out within the primary motor area, specific regions of it where motor signals get generated for sending to various body parts. So just to give an example, let's say for some reason you wanted to move one of your fingers. And so what this map is telling us is that region right there of the primary motor area, where it says fingers, that region right there is where the motor signals to move your fingers get generated. And if you want to move your lips, then that region right there of the primary motor area are where the motor signals for moving your lip muscles get generated. Yeah, kind of interesting. Anyway, so primary motor area generates the nerve signals, the motor nerve signals to control all of your voluntary muscles. Now, there's something interesting, however, about the primary motor area and its motor signals. The movements, the motor signals generated by the primary motor area are not smooth and coordinated. The motor signals that it generates are kind of jerky and uncoordinated movements of your muscles. Other parts of your brain are involved in smoothing out the motor signals generated by your primary motor area so that you can move in a smooth and coordinated manner. And so here's the way it works. These neurons within the primary motor area that generate the motor signals first send their signals down to some other regions of the brain. There's a region of the brain called the substantia nigra, and the neurons of the substantia nigra are involved in smoothing out those motor signals that come right out of the primary motor area. And it's not shown in this diagram, but there's another region of the brain called the cerebellum that's also involved in smoothing out the motor signals generated by the primary motor area. So there are two regions that are involved in smoothing out those motor signals. The two regions are the substantia nigra and the cerebellum. Now, I should mention here, on kind of a tangent, there's a disease called Parkinson's disease where these neurons that are involved in generating and smoothing out the motor signals start to die off. And so people with Parkinson's disease, they start losing the ability to use their voluntary muscles in a coordinated way. In other words, movements become more and more difficult for people with Parkinson's disease as those neurons within the brain that generate and smooth the motor signals start to die off. And those neurons within the brain that generate the motor signals and smooth them out, those neurons use dopamine as their neurotransmitter. And so people who are suffering from Parkinson's disease are sometimes given drugs that boost the dopamine neurotransmitter levels in their brain. And that helps them regain some control of their muscles. Even though they have fewer neurons in the part of the brain that generates and smooths the motor signals, the neurons that they do have work better when they're given extra dopamine. Anyway, so the point I'm making for right now is that we're talking about the cerebrum, and within the cerebrum is this area called the primary motor area, and that's where the motor signals to your voluntary muscles initially get generated. All right, well, let's talk about some other areas of your cerebrum. There's an area of your cerebrum called the amygdala, and its function is to generate fear sensations. If there's something that you're experiencing that your body says, hey, it's appropriate for you to feel fear in this situation, your amygdala is what generates those feelings of fear, those sensations of fear. And right next to it is another region of the cerebrum called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus specializes in generating several different types of emotions. And it's also, in addition to generating lots of different types of emotions, it's also involved in converting short-term memories into long-term memories. Short-term memories are things that just sort of happen to you moment to moment, but sometimes we want to remember something longer from than just a moment, and so those short-term memories have to be converted to long-term memories if we want to have them as long-term memories, and the hippocampus is involved in generating long-term memories. Now, the hippocampus and the amygdala are two parts of a larger region of the cerebrum that's called the limbic system. And so if you look in the lecture handout, it defines the limbic system as a group of cerebral areas that causes feelings of emotions, such as anger and fear and sadness and happiness and pleasure. And the limbic system is also involved in sex drive, how interested a person is in sex, and also in sensations of hunger. Now, I should mention that, yes, the limbic system is involved in generating feelings for various types of emotions, anger, fear, happiness, sadness, that sort of thing, and also in generating feelings of sex drive and hunger. But there's another region of the brain that we haven't talked about yet called the thalamus that's also involved in those functions. When we talk about the thalamus, you'll find out that the thalamus is part of a brain region called the diencephalon. But what I am saying is that the thalamus works with the limbic system in generating these various types of emotions, as well as feelings of sex drive and hunger. Well, we've talked about a lot of areas of the cerebrum so far, and some of their functions, like the limbic system. Well, we just talked about that. Various types of emotions and memories are generated there, and we talked about other regions, like the primary motor area where motor signals are generated, and the sensory areas, just to name a few. We're going to finish off our talk about the cerebrum with a few more of its areas and their functions. Now, this region right here is called the frontal lobe, and there are areas within the frontal lobe that allow us to control impulses and act socially. And so what's going on there is our brains generate impulses to do things and say things that are just antisocial. And so there are areas within the frontal lobe that act as sort of filters to prevent us from saying or doing those antisocial impulses that we have. And there's kind of a classic example of this impulse control center not working well. In the 1800s, there was a guy who worked for the railroads here in the United States named Phineas Gage. And while working on railroad construction, there was an accident with some dynamite and a metal bar. And a metal bar was propelled actually through one of his eye sockets and then through part of his frontal lobe. Here's a computer reconstruction of it. There you see the metal bar, passing through his eye socket and through part of his frontal lobe. And amazingly, he survived. But because this accident destroyed part of his frontal lobe, his personality utterly changed. He started acting very antisocially. Before the accident, apparently had a good temperament and was very mild mannered and behaved himself. And then after the accident, he swore profusely all the time, got in fights, drank all the time, visited prostitutes. He just had no control over his more antisocial and basic desires, and that's why, because it wiped out the part of his frontal lobe that works to control impulses. Now, another part of the frontal lobe is involved what they describe as motivation and reward, and basically that part generates feelings, well, of motivation that make us want to do whatever actions we feel like doing. And there's something that kind of relates to this also. It used to be many decades ago, if a mental patient had been institutionalized for violent behavior, the doctors would do an operation called a frontal lobotomy, where the doctors would deliberately do brain surgery and destroy part of the patient's frontal lobe to take away these motivation centers. And so the idea here would be that the person would get calm after that, permanently calm, because they wouldn't have motivation to do almost anything, but especially violent behaviors. And from my understanding, they don't do these lobotomies anymore, even on violent mental patients. It's no longer considered ethically correct, but at the time, that was one of the ways that they dealt with violent behavior, was doing these frontal lobotomies. All right, let's talk about some more regions of the cerebrum. I showed you this next slide before. Here we go. Remember that if you're looking down on the cerebrum from on top, it's actually divided into two halves called the cerebral hemispheres. Oops, I didn't want to go there yet. Go back. Here we go. It's divided into these two halves, the two cerebral hemispheres. So this is the person's left cerebral hemisphere, and this is the person's right cerebral hemisphere. And recall from when we talked about these cerebral hemispheres before, that for most regions of the brain, if you find a certain functional region on one side, you'll find the mirror image, that same functional region on the other side. And let me give you an example. So remember, there's these areas of the cerebrum called the auditory areas, where nerve signals from the ears go to, so we can experience the sound when the hearing nerve signals arrive there. Well, what I'm saying is, you have an auditory area for one of your ears here on your left cerebral hemisphere, and you have a matching auditory area for the other ear on your right cerebral hemisphere. So the two cerebral hemispheres are mirror images of each other in terms of that auditory area. And we also talked about the primary motor area, where where motor signals are generated, and you have part of the primary motor area on your left cerebral hemisphere and a mirror image of it on your right, for generating motor signals to your voluntary muscles on the left side of your body and on the right side of your body. So for most structures on one cerebral hemisphere, you find the mirror image, the matching structures on the right. But remember, I think we mentioned earlier that for a few areas and functions in the cerebral hemispheres, you only find them in one cerebral hemisphere and not on the other. And remember, the term for that was called cerebral lateralization, where there's an area in one hemisphere, but you don't find that area on the other. So let me mention a few things about that. What they found is your left cerebral hemisphere has some areas for language functions and math and logical functions. And your right cerebral hemisphere has areas for visual and spatial thoughts and facial recognition. And so for these types of functions, it's the cerebral lateralization. In other words, you find these functions only on the left cerebral hemisphere, and you find these functions only on the right cerebral hemisphere. Now, some people kind of half-jokingly say this is the science part of your brain, and this is the art part of your brain, because artists have to use a lot of visualization before they create their work of art. whereas scientists tend to use a lot of math and logic. Or they might say this person is very left-brained, meaning the person's sort of science-y and logic-y. Or they might say this person is sort of right-brained, meaning that person is more artistic. So just to give an example of some of these areas that you find only on one cerebral hemisphere but not the other, notice that language is more centered in your left cerebral hemisphere and not so much in your right cerebral hemisphere. So there's one area that's involved in language called Broca's area. And this is only found in the left cerebral hemisphere. And what it does is it's basically where you store the memories of how to move your lips and vocal cords and other speech parts of your body. You remember how to move those to form the words and sounds. Or to say the same thing in a slightly different way, if a person has damaged their Broca's area, the person knows what they want to say, but they don't remember how to move their lips and their mouth to say those words. Here's another language area that's also only found in the left cerebral hemisphere. It's called Wernicke's area. And the neurons in this area of the left cerebral hemisphere store the meaning of words. So a person who has damaged their Wernicke's area, they don't know the meaning of the words. You say the word hammer and they can't picture a hammer in their head. They don't know what it means. Or you say the word tree and they just can't picture a tree. They don't know what that word means. Okay, anyway, so what I'm saying in this part of the lecture is that certain areas of the cerebral hemispheres have cerebral lateralization, where they have different functions from each other. Oh, I should mention that in your web handout it says for the right cerebral hemisphere, it talks about spatial visualization, and a good example of that is mental maps. And so, as a good example, you probably have a pretty good mental map of your house. You know which rooms adjoin which other rooms, and which rooms are towards the front of the house and which rooms are towards the back of the house. You in your mind, you sort of know the mapping of your house. Well, that's the type of thing are called spatial thoughts or spatial visualization, and that type of mental maps are stored in your right cerebral hemisphere. Okay, well, so that's all we're going to talk about for the cerebrum, and I won't, fully review everything we talked about, but remember that it's the most superior. It's the highest of the four major regions of the brain. It's the largest of the four major regions of the brain, and it has a lot of important functions, like it generates your motor signals, your motor nerve impulses, your sense nerve impulses are sent to regions of your cerebrum. It's involved in forming memories. It forms involved in forming emotions, language, mathematics, mental maps. They are all located in various regions of the cerebrum. Okay, but that's it for the cerebrum. Remember that the cerebrum, though, is just one of the four major regions of the brain. The other major regions of the brain are the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. And so now we're going to move on to the next of the four major regions of the brain, the diencephalon. All right, well, notice that I colored the diencephalon in two shades of purple. The light shaded area and the darker purple area are both the regions of the diencephalon. The area that I'm showing in the lighter colored purple is called the thalamus, and the area I'm showing in the darker colored purple is called the hypothalamus. But those two together are the diencephalon part of the brain. So let's talk about the thalamus first. In your web handout, it says the thalamus is the region that routes incoming sense signals to the proper sense areas in the cerebrum. Okay, so here's what that's all about. So remember, when we were talking about the cerebrum a few minutes ago, I said there are areas in the cerebrum where the sense signals from your sense organs get sent to for proper analysis, so you can experience the taste or the smell or the touch or the sight or whatever the sense signal is. Well, as it turns out, all the signals from all your sense organs first arrive at the thalamus, and then your thalamus figures out somehow, oh, this is a touch signal, I need to send it to this particular sense area of the cerebrum, or this is a taste signal, I need to send it to that other region of the cerebrum, or this is a vision signal, so I need to send it to the visual area of the cerebrum. So it's kind of a routing center for incoming sense nerve signals. And I like to show this picture when I'm talking about the thalamus. These are switchboard operators from many decades ago. It used to be, in the old days of telephones, that you couldn't make long-distance calls by yourself. You had to do it through an operator. And I don't know why that is. I guess the telephone system at that time just wasn't robust enough for people to make long-distance calls by themselves. So if you wanted to call Miami, you called up the operator and you'd say, "Operator, I'd like to talk to Miami," and then she would connect you. And I say she because at that time all the switchboard operators were ladies. But anyway, if you'd say, "I want to talk to Miami," and she would physically take an electrical cable and connect your phone to the Miami switchboard. Or if you say, "Hey, I want to talk to Dallas," then she would literally take a cable and route your call, using that electrical cable to the Dallas switchboard. So anyway, so think of this as the thalamus. Incoming sense data comes into the thalamus, and your thalamus somehow routes all those incoming sense nerve signals to the proper regions of the cerebrum where they're supposed to go. And here in the gray, I've shown these various regions of the cerebrum. And let me give you an example. Let's just say that somebody touches part of your skin. So we're talking about a touch sensory nerve signal. So here comes that touch sensory nerve signal. The thalamus somehow figures out, hey, that's a touch sensory nerve signal, and so the thalamus sends it to the primary motor area, the primary sensory area, which is where the touch signals go for interpretation, like you see there. And then let's say next comes in a taste nerve signal from your mouth. Same thing, it arrives at the thalamus. The thalamus says, oh, okay, that's a taste nerve signal. It needs to be sent to the gustatory area of the cerebrum. And so it routes it to the proper sense area there. And here comes a visual signal. The thalamus says, okay, that's a visual signal. I need to send that to the visual cortex, and shoots it into that area of the cerebrum. And what else? Here comes a hearing nerve signal. Thalamus says, okay, that's a hearing nerve signal. I need to send it to the auditory area. Now, the thalamus is obviously a very busy place because, oftentimes, like if we're conversing with friends while eating a meal, we are tasting and hearing and seeing and smelling and touching even, all simultaneously. So the thalamus is kept busy, constantly routing all of these incoming nerve signals to their proper locations. Now, let me go on a slight tangent here. There's an interesting mental state called synesthesia, where the person has the wrong sensory experience to a sense signal. Like some people who have the synesthesia say that sounds have colors to them. Like they say, okay, if I get on the piano and play a, what is that? An F sharp, I guess. So I play an F sharp, I see dark blue. Or they say, hey, if I play a C note, I see red. And so what they think is going on, these people who have this synesthesia, is that their thalamus is routing the signals incorrectly. Like if a C sharp note comes in, that should go to the auditory area, but the thalamus somehow missends that sound to the visual cortex, and so the person sees colors. Or I've heard about people tasting colors. They look at a certain color and they have a taste experience. Or they see something and they have a feel experience. Like, they look at something and they get the sensation of touching sandpaper or touching something that's smooth and silky just by looking at something. Anyway, I think that's kind of fascinating. That's called synesthesia. All right, well, I've been talking about the thalamus part of the diencephalon, and again, that's the part that routes incoming sense signals to their proper areas in the cerebrum. Next, we're going to look at the hypothalamus. Hypo means beneath, And so the hypothalamus is this dark purple area right there that's just below the thalamus. There we go. Let's zoom in on it. So the hypothalamus, as you can see, is a lot smaller than the thalamus, but the hypothalamus is, don't be fooled by its small size. It's a very important part of the diencephalon. In the Webb handout, it describes it like this. It's a region that controls thirst, temperature, and sleep and wakefulness cycles. And there's actually several other things it does. So there are areas within the hypothalamus that I'll show like this that control a whole bunch of different things. So there's certain areas within the hypothalamus that help regulate your body temperature. There are areas in the hypothalamus that regulate your sleep and wakefulness cycles. There are areas in the hypothalamus that regulate your thirst, and areas that regulate hunger and your sex drive and your emotions. Now, you might say, wait a minute, we already talked about those. You might say, didn't you tell us earlier that the limbic system controls a lot of emotions and hunger and sex drive? And that's true. So what I'm saying is that the hypothalamus works with your limbic system to generate these feelings of sex drive and emotions and hunger. All right, and one more thing about the hypothalamus. Here you see the hypothalamus again right here. There is an endocrine gland called the pituitary gland that's connected to the hypothalamus. Endocrine glands are glands in the body that secrete hormones, and one of the most important of your endocrine glands is called the pituitary gland. And yes, the pituitary gland is connected to your hypothalamus, and in fact the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland what hormones to secrete and how much of those hormones to secrete. Well, that's all we're going to talk about for the diencephalon region of the brain. Just a quick recap: it's made out of the thalamus that routes sensory nerve signals to their proper areas of the cerebrum, and the diencephalon also includes the hypothalamus, which controls emotions and hunger and thirst and sex drive and body temperature, and the hypothalamus also controls the hormones secreted by the pituitary gland. Okay, well, so that was the second of the four major brain regions. We've done the cerebrum and the diencephalon. The third of the four major brain regions is the one that I've shaded in green right here, and that's called the brainstem. And just to be clear, the brainstem is not the spinal cord. The spinal cord is actually connected to the bottom of the brainstem. This sort of yellowish region you see at the very bottom is the spinal cord, but the brainstem is different. The brainstem is part of the brain. It's not the spinal cord. Okay, well, so in your lecture handout, it describes the location of the brainstem. It says that it's a tubular-shaped region of the brain that's between the diencephalon and the spinal cord, right? Now you can see the brainstem has the diencephalon on top of it and the spinal cord at the bottom, so it's between those two. And it says here that it controls many important body functions. The brainstem is divided into three regions. This part right here that's right next to the diencephalon is called the midbrain. This part right here is called the pons, and this region right here is called the medulla oblongata. These different regions of the brainstem have different functions. The midbrain region contains within it a area called the substantia nigra, and I think I mentioned this before. The substantia nigra helps smooth out motor signals from your primary motor area. Here we go. And so, yeah, so remember that up here in your cerebrum is an area of the cerebrum called the primary motor area. There it is. And the primary motor area generates motor signals. It generates nerve signals that eventually get sent to your voluntary muscles, so you can move your voluntary muscles, move your arms and legs and facial muscles and whatnot. So it generates the primary motor area in the cerebrum generates motor signals, but the motor signals it generates are not smooth. They're kind of jerky and uncoordinated. And so the primary motor area, its neurons actually send the signals to the substantia nigra, and the substantia nigra smooths out those uncoordinated jerky signals coming from the primary motor area And so, the substantia nigra helps you move in a smooth and coordinated manner. Now, the cerebellum, this part of the brain right here, also is involved in smoothing out the motor signals, and so the cerebellum and the substantia nigra working together are what smooth out the motor signals. All right, and then these other two regions of the brainstem, the pons right here and the medulla oblongata right there. Those two regions, the pons and the medulla oblongata, have a lot of very important centers just for the proper functioning of your body, control centers that keep you alive. For instance, as you can see here, there are some respiratory control centers that regulate your ability to breathe in and out. Those are there in the pons and the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. There are some other centers here in the medulla oblongata that control your heart rate, keeping your heart beating properly, and other ones control your proper blood pressure. And so, obviously your heart beating correctly and proper blood pressure and breathing correctly are very important to your survival. And so if a person has damaged their brainstem, oftentimes that's fatal. Their body just can't go on living if the breathing centers or the heart rate centers or the blood pressure centers have been damaged. All right, and so there's the brainstem. And now for the fourth and last of the four major brain regions, the cerebellum. In the Webb handout, it defines the cerebellum as a round region of the brain located posterior to the brainstem, which means behind. And you can see that here. Here's the cerebellum, and it's definitely behind the brainstem. All right, so what does the cerebellum do? Well, it gives us, for one thing, it gives us the ability to stand with balance. Most people, if you ask them to stand upright and don't sway, most people could stand upright with very little, if any, swaying. But the ability to do that, to stand with balance, comes from your cerebellum. Or saying the same thing in the opposite way, if a person has damaged that region of their cerebellum, they can't stand without swaying. They'll wobble back and forth. They'll sway because that region of their cerebellum has been damaged. Another function of the cerebellum is something that's sometimes called motor learning, and some people call it learning movements by heart, or sometimes it's called muscle memory. And what this is, movements that you've done so many times, so repeatedly, that you can do them without thinking about them. That's what they mean by motor learning or muscle memory or learning things by heart. So what I'm saying is those muscle memories are stored inside your cerebellum. Just to give an example of such a thing, several years ago, I decided I would try to learn to play guitar. And what I actually ended up with learning is that I'm lousy at music. But when I was first trying to learn to play the guitar, it was difficult for me to put my fingers in all the right places on the frets. The learning book would say, okay, put your ring finger on the third fret of the E string and put your pinky on the second fret of the D string. And at first I had to really think about it quite hard to make sure my fingers were in all the right places. But then after a while, it started coming more naturally. I would just sort of think of a C chord, and it's almost with my fingers, almost as if they knew exactly what a C chord was supposed to be, and they would almost automatically go right into the proper place by themselves. And so that's the type of thing that's muscle memory. And yes, your muscle memories are stored inside your cerebellum. And yet another function of the cerebellum, and I've mentioned this one a couple times, is smoothing out motor signals. So again, remember that motor signals, the signals to move your voluntary muscles, are first generated in the primary motor area of the cerebrum, but those initial signals are uncoordinated and not smooth at all. And so the primary motor area sends those motor signals to the substantia nigra and also to the cerebellum to become smoothed out. Okay, believe it or not, we are done covering the brain. We're done covering the four main regions of the brain, and just as a reminder, here they are: largest and most superior cerebrum, and then below that the diencephalon, and then below that the brainstem, and then posterior to the brainstem, the cerebellum. And we went over many of the most important regions and functions of all four of these major brain regions, so you're familiar with those now. Okay, well, remember that the brain is just one part of the central nervous system. And so now we're going to do the other part of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord. So imagine we just sort of look a little bit further down right there, and starting in yellow right there, that represents the spinal cord. If you look at the lecture handout, it says the spinal cord, a downward extension of the nervous tissue from the brainstem. And what I mean by that is that the spinal cord, the top of the spinal cord, connects smoothly to the bottom of the brainstem. There's no abrupt border between the two. They just flow smoothly into each other. The next picture shows kind of a more zoomed out view of the central nervous system. There's the brain right there, and there's the spinal cord coming down right there. Now, so we may ask, what makes the spinal cord such an important part of the nervous system? And the answer is this: most of the nerve signals that travel between the brain and the rest of the body travel through the spinal cord. So think of it as a main thoroughfare, like a main freeway for most of the nerve signals between the brain and the rest of the body. Now, to be a little bit more specific about that, there's actually only two types of signals that travel through the spinal cord, and those are motor signals and touch sense signals. Now remember that motor signals are the signals that control muscles, signals to contract muscles, and touch sense signals are just what they sound like. They're the nerve signals that originate from your sense of touch. Let's see that in action. So remember, motor signals originate in the brain, but then what I'm saying is the brain sends most of those motor signals downward in the spinal cord. So think of that as one of the functions of the spinal cord, is to carry motor signals downward. And touch signals are sense signals that can be detected anywhere in the skin, but most of the touch signals in your body are sent upward to the brain through the spinal cord. Yeah, so that's the way to picture the spinal cord. It's like a superhighway. It's like a freeway with touch signals going upward towards the brain, and simultaneously it's carrying motor signals downward away from the brain. Now, you might ask, well, why only touch sense signals? Why are those the only sense signals that use the spine? And the answer is that your other sense organs, your eyes and your nose and your ears and your mouth, they're in the head. And so those sense signals don't have to travel through the spine to get to the brain. They can go through cranial nerves to get to the brain. But the touch signals come from your skin all over your body. And so for your skin, it's those touch signals have to get to the brain by using the spinal cord. Okay, so let me stop these signals for a second. So this illustration obviously shows the brain and the spinal cord, which together are the central nervous system. But remember, there's also the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nervous tissue outside the brain and the spinal cord, the PNS. And most of this is nerves. Well, remember that the nerves that connect to the spinal cord are called spinal nerves. So all these nerves that are below her head, all these nerves that you see here connecting to the spine, are spinal nerves. And if you think of the spine as, like a freeway, like an expressway for motor signals and touch sense signals, think of the spinal nerves as on-ramps and off-ramps to the freeway. In other words, those spinal nerves are where nerve signals in the peripheral nervous system get into the spinal cord, and where nervous signals in the spinal cord exit the spinal cord to get out into the peripheral nervous system. All right, let me go off on a slight give some examples here of what I'm talking about. So imagine a touch signal. Something touches her elbow right here. Then, it's sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system that detect sense stimulation like that touch. And so, there's going to be a sensory neuron that detects that touch. And then that touch sense signal travels up through one of her spinal nerves there to get to the spinal cord. And so, that's the end of that spinal nerve right there. And then at that point, the touch nerve signal jumps into the spinal cord. And so now that signal's inside the spinal cord of the central nervous system. And then once it's inside the spinal cord, it shoots right up to the brain. And now she is aware that something touched her arm. She has the sensory experience of feeling something touch her arm. If she decides that she wants to move some muscle in that arm, the signaling goes in reverse. Her brain generates a motor signal which shoots down the spinal cord to the level where the nerve is that goes to that muscle. And so again, think of these nerves as like being on-ramps and off-ramps for nervous signals going through the spine. Yeah, so that motor signal then exits the spine and goes into that spinal nerve right there, and now it travels through the spinal nerve to the muscle that motor signal is going to be delivered to. Good. So the point of all that is that motor signals and sense signals travel through the nerves in the peripheral nervous system, but then they always connect those spinal nerves, connect them to the spine, and so the signals can also go up and down the spine before or after going through these nerves here in their peripheral nervous system. Let me give another example. Let's say something touches her hip right here. Same situation that we talked about before. Sensory neurons in her skin detects the touch right there. That touch sense signal first travels through a spinal nerve to get to the spinal cord, and then once it arrives at the end of the spinal nerve, it now goes into the spinal cord, and now the spinal cord shoots it on up towards the brain, and now she becomes aware that something has touched her hip. And then if she wants to now move a muscle in her hip, then the brain generates a motor signal which travels down the spinal cord until it gets to the nerve that's nearest the muscle she wants to move. And then it exits the spinal cord, the motor signal exits the spinal cord, goes through that spinal nerve and arrives at the muscle, and that's how she moves that muscle in her hip. And let's do one more example. Let's say something touches her on her thigh right here. Same thing. Sensory neurons in the skin detect the touch. They generate a touch sensory nerve signal. It gets sent through a spinal nerve until it reaches the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord then shoots it up towards the brain, and then she becomes aware that something touched her thigh. She feels something touches her thigh, and then if she wants to move a thigh muscle, the brain generates a motor neuron, a motor signal, which goes down the spine. It exits the spine at the spinal nerve nearest that muscle, and then the spinal nerve takes the motor signal on down to the appropriate muscle. So again, think of the spinal cord as being like an expressway for motor signals coming down and touch signals going up, and the spinal nerves are the on-ramps and off-ramps that those nerve signals can get into the spinal cord or out of the spinal cord. Okay, good. Well, before we go on to the next subject that relates to the spinal cord, let me talk about when the spinal cord gets broken. So, usually this happens in some sort of traumatic accident, maybe a car accident or a person falls from a height, and they can sometimes get a break in their spinal cord. And unfortunately, that never heals. Nervous tissue just doesn't have the ability to heal itself. But what are the effects of when there's a break, when there's a cut in the spinal cord? Well, it depends on where in the spinal cord the break is. Imagine, for example, that she's had some sort of accident and her spinal cord gets broken about here, about the level of her hips. Well, then if you think about what's going to happen, the brain can no longer send any motor signals past that break right there, and so she will not be able to use any of the muscles in her hips or below. No muscles in her hips or her thighs or her legs or her feet or her toes can ever get any brain signal. She will be paralyzed below the waist. And likewise, she won't be able to feel anything below the waist, because if anything touches her anywhere down there, the touch sense signals are not going to be able to get up to the brain. Now, she'll have full sensation and full use of her upper body because that's above the brake, and so her brain can still get touch signals from anywhere in her torso or her thorax or her arms or anything above the brake. That will be fine. She can still feel that. And likewise, she can send motor signals down to those muscles anywhere above the brake, and so she has full body sensation and muscle use above the brake. Well, in a situation like you see here, where there's the lower half of the body, the brain can't communicate with because of the break in the spinal cord in the hip region, but the upper half of the body that the brain can communicate with because it's above the brake, that's called, you say the person is a paraplegic. And so, like I was describing, these people have full use of their upper body, but not of their lower body. They can move all the muscles in their upper part of their body and get touch sensation in the upper part of their body, but the muscles below the brake are paralyzed and they have no touch sensation below the brake. They are paraplegics. What's more severe is when the brake is in the neck area, because again, no signals then can get past where that brake is, and so the person has no touch sensation, no feeling of anything, any part of their body below their neck, and likewise they can't activate any muscles below their neck. They're completely paralyzed below their neck, and so that state is called, you see, the person is a quadriplegic. Quadri means four, because all four limbs, both arms and both legs, as well as the rest of her body below the brake, no sensation, no touch feeling, and no muscle use. As an example that I remember when I was growing up, a person who became a quadriplegic, this man's name was Christopher Reeves. I think he's passed away at this point, but he actually starred in the very first Superman movie, the first Superman movie ever. He was the star, and then later on in his life, he broke his neck in a horse riding accident. He fell off the horse somehow and broke his neck, and yeah, he became a quadriplegic for the rest of his life. Okay, anyway, just to recap a little bit about the spinal cord, it's like an expressway for sending motor signals downward from the brain to the muscles in the body, and it also is like an expressway for the touch sense signals for most of the body to travel upward towards the brain. Well, what I want to do now is take a little bit closer look at the anatomy of the spinal cord, and we're going to see exactly how those motor signals travel downward and how the touch signals travel upward, and we're also going to see how those nerves there in the peripheral nervous system form junctions with the spinal cord. Okay, to see the anatomy of the spinal cord, let's imagine zooming in on it. Let's imagine that we're going to somehow zoom in right on, close up on her spinal cord right there. Here it is. So there's her spinal cord. Now, for the moment, I'm not going to show any of the spinal nerves that connect to it, but let's just, pretend this is the spinal cord. Okay, now if we want to see the anatomy of, what's inside the spinal cord, so to speak, imagine that we had some sort of scalpel and we're going to cut it transversely. We're going to cut the spinal cord in cross-section like this. Okay, and then imagine that we can lift the two halves apart so we can see the interior of the spinal cord. There it is. Okay, so just visually, what does it look like? Well, it looks like sort of a gray butterfly, right? But it's white along the edges right there. In your lecture handout, it describes this. It says the center of the spinal cord is gray matter. And remember, gray matter means the cell bodies and dendrites of neurons. Anyway, so the gray matter of the spinal cord forms kind of a butterfly shape in the middle. But outside that is white matter. And remember, white matter is the axons of neurons, because the axons have myelin around them, and myelin is white. That's what the white matter is. So the white matter is axons of neurons. Okay, let's be a little more specific now about what the white matter is. Okay, so the white matter of the spinal cord are descending tracts and ascending tracts. And remember, tracts are essentially nerves. They're bundles of neurons in the central nervous system. Okay, so if you had to guess, what sort of signals are coming in the descending tracts, the downward moving tracts? Well, the answer is motor signals, because remember, motor signals go downward in the spine, away from the brain and downward in the spine. And which sort of signals use the ascending tracts in the spine? And the answer there is touch sensory signals, right? Because those are the ones that go upward in the spine. Okay, yeah, so the when you see just a review, when you see the spine in cross section, the white matter is towards there's a gray butterfly looking thing in the middle of gray matter, but the white matter's towards the outside of the butterfly, and all of that white matter you see in the spine are descending tracts and ascending tracts. And the descending tracts carry motor signals down in the spine, and the ascending tracts carry touch sensory signals upward in the spine. All right, so now we understand the white matter of the spinal cord, that those are the ascending and descending tracts. So what about the gray matter? What is this gray matter here in the middle of the spinal cord, and why does it have this butterfly shape to it? Well, the web handout partially answers that. If you look in the web handout, it says, the gray matter contains cell bodies of motor neurons and axon terminals of sensory neurons and interneurons that synapse with the motor neurons and sensory neurons. You might say, okay, but why those parts of neurons, and why does it look like a butterfly shape? Well, we'll answer that question in a few minutes. So in other words, I'll come back to that part of the web handout that describes the gray matter and why it has a butterfly shape in a minute. Let's first talk about the spinal nerves again. So now we're going to zoom out. So there's the whole spinal cord, and yes, these yellow things that branch on and off to the spinal cord all throughout the spinal cord are the spinal nerves. Those are, by definition, are nerves that connect with the spinal cord. All right, so there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they always come in pairs. In other words, if, let's say, at this location of the spine, if there's a spinal nerve connecting to the spine right there towards her right side of her body, then there's a matching spinal nerve that connects to the spine at that same spot going off towards the left side of her body. And same right here. There's a spinal nerve here exiting the spine towards the right side of her body, so there's the matching pair of it exiting the spine at that same spot but going off towards the left-hand side of her body. Good. So 31 pairs of spinal nerves all along the spine. All right, so let's just look at one of these spinal nerves. Let's, imagine that we're going to zoom in just on this part of the spine, and let's begin just by looking at this one spinal nerve that connects to the spine on the woman's right-hand side, right there. Okay, there is that spinal nerve right there. But notice just when that spinal nerve is connecting to the spine, it branches into two branches that connect independently from the spine, independently to the spine. This one right here is those are called the roots. Yeah, so each spinal nerve is just one nerve, so to speak. But right when it gets near the spine, right when it's about to connect to the spine, it branches into two roots. And they call this root back here the dorsal root, and they call this root right here the ventral root. Dorsal means towards the back, because this part of the spinal cord diagram right here is the part towards the back of the spine, towards the posterior, the part that faces the back of her body. And this part of the spine is the anterior part. Ventral means anterior, means frontward, and so that's the part of the spine that faces the front of her body. So that's why they call this the dorsal root, and that's why they call this one the ventral root. Cool. So each spinal nerve branches into two roots, a dorsal root and a ventral root, just when it connects to the just where it connects to the spinal cord. Alrighty. Now, the spinal nerves are what they call mixed nerves. And we talked about this term mixed nerves before. It means nerves that contain motor neurons and sensory neurons. Here we go. So if you look at the nerve here, yes, it contains some motor neurons and some sensory neurons, and that's what the splitting is all about into the roots. Those motor neurons and sensory neurons are bundled together in the spinal nerve until the spinal nerve gets to the roots, right when it's about to connect to the spinal cord. And at that point, the two types of neurons in the spinal nerve move apart from each other. The sensory neurons branch off into the dorsal root, and then they connect to the spine, and the motor neurons branch off into the ventral root, and that's where they connect to the spine. Cool. Yeah. So the two roots of each spinal nerve, the dorsal root contains the sensory neurons, and the ventral root contains the motor neurons. Okay. Now, very good. Now, notice that the sensory neurons, they have their cell bodies here, right next to the spine. And I'm only showing one sensory neuron here, but of course each spinal nerve contains many sensory neurons and many motor neurons. And so imagine this is just a whole bunch of sensory neuron cell bodies all clustered together there. Well, we learned a term for that. A cluster of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglion, right? And so that location right there in the dorsal root, where you have a cluster of these sensory neuron cell bodies, is called the dorsal root ganglion. It's a cluster of neuron cell bodies here inside this nerve, and you actually can see the dorsal root ganglion as sort of a bulgy part of the dorsal root if you were actually to look at someone's spine, in an anatomy class. All right, and so let's look at some nerve signals. Let's begin by imagining a touch sensory nerve signal. So these sensory neurons that you see here are touch neurons, and so they're connected to the skin. So let's say something touched her skin, and so that touch sensory nerve signal would travel through that spinal nerve, like you see there, passing into the dorsal root, and then the axon terminal of that sensory neuron synapses with interneurons here inside the gray matter of the spinal cord. And just remember, interneurons are the neurons that you find inside the central nervous system. So the interneurons are the neurons that you find inside the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, now, so quick question here. So that touch sensory nerve signal, when it gets put into the spinal cord by that sensory neuron, which direction is that touch signal going to go, up or down? And the answer is up, because that touch signal is supposed to get up to the brain, right? And that's upward. Okay, so what sort of structures here in the white matter are going to carry that touch signal upward? We just talked about that. Think of what the white matter of the spinal cord is. It's tracts, right? And so the touch signals that come into the spinal cord from those spinal nerves will get passed into, come on, where is it? Darn it. There it is. Those touch signals that get passed into the spinal cord by those sensory neurons pass into interneurons that are part of ascending tracts. And so, yeah, watch that touch signal. It gets passed from the sensory neuron in the peripheral nervous system into an interneuron in the spine, and that interneuron is part of an ascending tract, and so now the touch signal, boom, gets shot up towards the brain, and now she can, experience the sensation that something has touched her. So, we're beginning to explain the butterfly shape of the gray matter, at least this one wing of the gray butterfly right here. You see why it's gray matter. Gray matter is cell bodies and dendrites, right? And so that's what we see here. We see the cell body of this interneuron of an ascending tract and its dendrites synapsing with that axon terminal there. So that's going to be gray matter right there. So that's that one wing of the butterfly, so to speak. Okay, so those are the how the touch signals nervous signals move from the spinal nerve into the spine and then on up through ascending tracts to the brain. The spine, of course, also carries motor signals downward. Now let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Here is an interneuron of a descending tract carrying motor signals downward. And so when that motor signal comes to the end of the neuron here, of that descending tract, it synapses with it. It gets passed into a motor neuron, and then that motor signal will now be in the motor neuron. It will get carried through this ventral root right here, and then eventually go into the nerve here, and then get passed on to the muscle, which is, of course, the ultimate destination of motor signals. Here comes that motor signal down the interneuron of the descending tract. It synapses with the motor neuron right there, and then the motor neuron now has that motor signal, and it delivers it to whatever muscle that motor signal is going to. And so now we're beginning to explain this wing of the gray butterfly over here. That is where you have the axon terminal of this descending tract passing the motor signal to the cell body and the dendrites of this motor neuron right there, which then, brings that signal into the ventral root of the spinal nerve and then into the spinal nerve itself. Good, yeah, so the more posterior wing of the gray matter butterfly of the spine is where there's synapses between the sensory neurons and the interneurons of ascending tracts, and the more anterior, the more front-facing gray wing of the butterfly, that is where the interneurons of descending tracts synapse with the dendrites in the cell body of the motor neurons, and then that wing of the butterfly connects to the ventral root of the spinal nerve. All right, now of course all these signals are moving both ways simultaneously. In any spot in the spine, you have these sensory touch signals being delivered through the ventral root into the ascending tracts of the spine, and you also have motor signals coming down and being delivered to the motor neurons, which connect here through the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Okay, now I think is a good time for us to go back to that previous section of the lecture handout that I kind of glossed over, the part that talks about the gray matter inside the spinal cord. So in the web handout, it said the gray matter contains cell bodies of motor neurons and axon terminals of sensory neurons and the interneurons that synapse with those motor neurons and sensory neurons. And so now you can see that a little more clearly. The gray body, at least in this, the gray matter, at least in this zone, is this interneuron here synapsing with the axon terminal of the sensory neuron, and this part of the gray matter right here is the axon terminal of this interneuron synapsing with the dendrites and cell body of this motor neuron. So yeah, that's the butterfly shape of the gray matter. It's axon terminals of sensory neurons, cell bodies and dendrites of motor neurons, and the interneurons that synapse with them. That's the wings of the butterfly, so to speak. Okay, let me stop the nerve signals for just a second here. So notice that I added something now into this figure right here. I stuck a little interneuron right here, but notice that's not part of an ascending tract or a descending tract. It's just going right from the axon terminal of this sensory neuron right to the dendrites of this motor neuron. So hopefully you might find that intriguing. You might say, well, what's the point of that interneuron? Is it it's not sending any signals upward or downward, to or from the brain. What's it doing there? Just connecting that sensory neuron to that motor neuron. Well, if you think about what this means, it means that when there's a touch signal, then that touch signal is going to be routed through this motor neuron, but right to this motor neuron. And so this motor neuron is going to have, activate some muscle right away. As soon as the touch signal arrives at the spine, nothing is being sent up to the brain. And so there's going to be a muscle contraction, a response that just happens automatically, without the brain getting involved, because it's just sort of hardwired into essentially a loop. Touch signal comes into the spine, loops through, and then back out of the spine to activate some muscle. Well, that is a reflex. A reflex is a response to some stimulation, and the response is rapid, involuntary, and predictable. And the important part there is involuntary. Reflexes are involuntary because the signal, doesn't, I should say, the response, like the muscle contraction, doesn't depend on the sense signal being up to does not depend on the sense signal being shot up to the brain through an ascending tract, and then the brain deciding what to do and sending a motor signal on down. The response is just hardwired. The sensory signal comes into the spine. It gets pretty much instantly passed into a motor neuron that comes out of the spine, and then you get the reaction, the muscle contraction. That's a reflex. Probably the best example of a reflex that people are most familiar with is called the patellar reflex. Some people informally call it the knee-jerk reflex. Oh yeah, so there's a picture of it. So there's that touch signal, comes right into the spine, and then almost instantly gets passed by way of this interneuron into this motor neuron right here, then motor neuron on the right back. So there's going to be a rapid and involuntary response to the stimulus. But as I was about to say, probably the most familiar reflex that people know about is called the patellar reflex. Its informal name is the knee-jerk reflex. And we've all had this done to us, I'm sure, at doctors' offices. They sit you on a table practically, then the doctor gets this little rubber mallet and kind of bonks you just below the kneecap, and what happens? Your leg kicks out, right? And so that's a reflex. It's completely involuntary. You couldn't stop yourself from kicking out. That kicking out reflex when the doctor bonks that tendon right there is hardwired. It's a reflex. You have no choice in it. This next figure shows the pathway there. When the doctor hits this tendon just below your patella, that stretches your quadricep muscle. And there are some sensory neurons inside the quadricep muscle that detect that stretch. And so those sensory neurons then, generate a nerve signal. As you can see, that nerve signal gets passed through the sensory neurons into the spine, and then they synapse with the motor neuron here that now takes a motor signal right out of the spine, and it brings that signal right back to the quadricep muscle, which causes it to contract, and your leg kicks out there. So again, notice that nothing in here involved any ascending tracts to make the brain aware that a sensory signal had been generated, and it did not involve any descending tracts from the brain to send that motor signal. It all just went to the spine, then right back out of the spine. It's just the response is just hardwired when that stimulus occurs. And incidentally, the pathway that the nerve signal goes, traveling through this particular sensory neuron and then synapsing with this motor neuron, then coming right back out of the spine, the pathway that a reflex nerve signal goes through is called the reflex arc. And here you see it here. Here's that nerve signal coming through this particular sensory neuron right here, and then it passes into this motor neuron, and then from that passes into this interneuron, and then out of that interneuron to this particular motor neuron. So those neurons that this particular reflex signal is going through, that pathway is called the reflex arc of this particular reflex. Now, in some reflex arcs, there is an interneuron within the gray matter of the spinal cord, so that the sensory nerve signal gets passed to that interneuron, and the interneuron passes the signal as a motor signal now onto this motor neuron right here. But some reflex arcs, there is no interneuron between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. With some reflex arcs, the axon terminal, the sensory neuron, synapses directly with the dendrites of the motor neuron. So all sensory reflex arcs have a sensory neuron and a motor neuron as part of the arc. But some have an interneuron between those two, and some don't. Some it's just the sensory neuron passing the signal directly to the motor neuron. All right, let's see now. So remember that spinal nerves always come in left-right pairs. And so wherever you have one spinal nerve connecting to the spine, on the other side of it, you'll find the matching pair of that spinal nerve also connecting to the spine. So at any spot on the spine where spinal nerves connect, you'll have a dorsal root and a ventral root on one side, like on the right-hand side of the spine, and you'll have a matching dorsal root and ventral root on the other side of the spine. And so that explains why the gray matter is a butterfly. It's got two wings pointing towards the person's right-hand side for that dorsal root and that ventral root of the right-hand spinal nerve at that spot, and the other two wings of the gray butterfly are for the dorsal root and the ventral root of the other spinal nerve that's going off towards the person's left-hand side. Oh, and while I'm reviewing, the white part of the cross-section of the spine are the ascending and descending tracts, where these sensory sense signals can ascend, go up towards the brain, and where the motor signals can come down from the brain and synapse with the motor neurons. Okay, that brings us to an end to our discussion of the spinal cord. Now, remember, of course, that the spinal cord and the brain together are the central nervous system. So now we've gone over the brain and the spinal cord in this lecture, so you're good with the central nervous system. But of course, remember the other part of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, which is of course mostly all these nerves that connect with the central nervous system. The spinal nerves and the cranial nerves. So what we're going to do in the next video on the nervous system, the following video, is to focus in on the peripheral nervous system. Now, I remember the naming's a little confusing. This video is Nervous System Lecture Part 3, but I split Part 3 into two videos. So the one that we just watched here on the central nervous system is video Nervous System Lecture Part 3a, and this next video, the one on the peripheral nervous system, is Nervous System Lecture Part 3b. Okay, I'll see you in Nervous System Lecture Part 3b.